They say too much of a good thing can be a bad thing, but in the case of Insomniac's Spider-Man 2, that isn't true. While series fatigue does seem destined for the horizon, it hasn't set in yet. Spider-Man 2 takes a lot of what was great about the first game and Miles Morales and just delivers more of it. Fast-paced, expressive travel, fluid Arkham-style combat, a rogues gallery of Marvel villains, and a heartfelt Spider-Man story is all experienced in a gorgeous but relatively lifeless world. While many elements feel straight out of the previous games, small but not insignificant additions have been made to offer up a touch more variety to the standard playstyle. Arguably though, the most significant addition the title offers up to longtime fans of the webhead is getting a chance to witness two Spider-Men act in tandem. We've seen crossovers in the comics and in the movies, but this is the first time we get to see Miles and Peter play off of each other in video game form, and it works really well. Spider-Man 2 isn't going to blow away anyone who's played and enjoyed the first two games, but getting one of these titles every couple years does feel like a treat. Instead of chasing innovation, it's clear that Insomniac is alright with just telling a good Spider-Man story while accompanying it with some fluid, fast, and rewarding gameplay. It's something that has and will appeal to many gamers, a nice and comforting experience to keep you cozy as we head into the holiday season. And yes, this video does contain spoilers, so be wary of that, and now let's get into the review. Open world design has always been one of the most interesting components of gaming. How developers not only build their physical space, but also how they bring it to life with character and culture. Spider-Man 2 is in a unique situation compared to other open world games, as it's a world built to be experienced from the tips of skyscrapers, while people and cars look like mere ants below. Occasionally, a set of low buildings may see you skim the surface, but much of what is going on at ground level will go unnoticed by players as they swing blissfully unaware through the urban jungle. This is the case much like it was in the previous two games, despite the size of the city practically doubling, with districts like Queens and Coney Island being added for this iteration. You can always dip down to street level, but you aren't going to find much outside of some random NPC dialogue devoid of character or meaning. And that's perfectly fine. This isn't a game about traversing a new fantastical world. This is the city, baby, and the larger-than-life buildings made up of reinforced steel beams and a ton of window pane glass is really all you need. This isn't a world meant for traditional exploration. It's one built for traversal, for speed, for flight, and for feeling the wind as city blocks buzz past you in the blink of an eye. There are no small towns or personalities to uncover. No, the joy of exploration here comes from seeing how fast you can zip from one side of the city to the other, or finding and climbing the tallest building only to jump off and zip around some more. And in this way, despite New York City feeling extremely familiar to those of us who've played all three games, there's still a simple but satisfying feeling that arises from traversal. Moving around is rewarding in its own right, as the moment-to-moment decisions within it allow for an unheralded sense of player expression. Do I want to go around that skyscraper, or perhaps run up it? Should I do a point launch to gain some speed, or should I maintain my web swing? And is now a good time to activate the web wings? Oh, yeah, those are new too. With a single press of a button, Peter and Miles activate their web wings for a faster approach, using all that built-up momentum to glide across vast stretches of city blocks. Even the East River, I think that's the East River, can't contain you as you simply glide over top of it. These felt like a tacked-on addition at first, but the more I used the wings, the more I enjoyed them. With nearly double the explorable space, it was smart to give players a way to move faster than ever before. The inclusion of wind tunnels to blast you forward, as well as rising air to lift you up, only adds to the fun. Weaving the web wings in with normal swings was a ton of fun, and once again made traversal one of the most impressive elements of the game's design, even if it is taken for granted. And if you do ever find yourself taking it for granted, try going into the settings and change how the swing assistance works. By lowering it, you get a more realistic experience, and it's kinda crazy. But as I alluded to before, the city isn't anything special in its own right. It's a space we've seen half of before, and the new half feels just as unremarkable. It's hard to pull Spider-Man out of New York City as it feels so integral to his character, but I wouldn't mind if a third title took place somewhere else, just to offer up something new. With that being said, the urban jungle does provide an element that really helps define Peter Parker as well as Miles' life. That being the constant imbalance between their personal lives and their duties as Spider-Man. It's always been a part of the character's stories, needing to be in two places at once, and you do sorta get that feeling here. As you're swinging towards your next mission, bam, something pops up. Sometimes it's a speeding vehicle or an armed robbery. Other times it's an opportunity to photograph a piece of New York City culture. Or maybe it's a challenge to be completed, or just a really tall building to climb. There's constant distractions being offered up throughout the city, derailing you from the intended path, but only momentarily. And while main missions will wait for you as long as you'd like, there's a distinct feeling that you're being pulled away between many options, and it really fits this hero well. Alright, let's keep this gameplay theme going with a look at combat. Returning from the previous two games is that distinct system that's inspired from the Batman Arkham games. It's a system built around stacking combos to maximize damage and how stylish you look. You're meant to wail on enemies while being mindful that some of them have modifiers and attacks that you need to account for. Most obvious is dodging a simple attack, but there's also unblockable attacks, there's parryable attacks, enemies that parry certain moves you have, enemies that block themselves, and more. The key to success is identifying which enemies will provide what challenges, and then act accordingly and in rhythm as to not let your combo diminish. It's a system you'll be immediately familiar with if you've played any Batman Arkham games, or the previous Insomniac Spider-Man games. Regardless of if you're playing as Peter or Miles, combat functions this way, dealing with mobs of foes while accounting for the variations amongst them, forcing you to react fast enough to those variations to avoid losing your combo and thus taking damage. And when you do that, it feels like you're as smooth as butter. This is due to the incredible animation work that has gone into the game. Seriously, everything moves so fast that it's easy to let it go unnoticed, but it's absolutely incredible how meticulous they were in making these Spider-Men feel so fast and so fluid. From punches to dodges to parries to shooting webs and more, everything looks stunning and smooth, which certainly enhances the enjoyment derived from beating up lowlives and aliens. There's a fluidity and grace that can be felt when pulling off impressive chains of attacks, dodges, and repositioning moves. With that being said, Spider-Man 2 is notably easier than the previous two games if you take the time to complete the side content as it unlocks. Doing so rewards you with tokens that can be used to purchase upgrades for your equipment, while also providing experience to pump into skill trees. If you go down this path, it's very easy to feel overpowered, and I reckon that remains true even if you stick to just the main story. And the reason I say that is because of how many alternate forms of attack you're granted. There's 4 different spider gadgets that each have multiple uses, as well as 4 different abilities that function on a cooldown. Finishing moves make a return that can instantly KO most enemies, and each hero also unlocks a super attack as the story progresses. This represents a lot of additional powerful maneuvers that can really trivialize fights. The biggest offender would be the web grabber, which pulls enemies and environmental objects together, smashing them all up and doing damage in the process. This one gadget was extremely effective at crowd control, and paired with the other multiple use tools like Sonic Burst, Ricochet Web, and Upshot meant some fights ended without enemies even getting within striking distance. And when the foes kept pouring in, devastating super abilities cleared them out too. Fights lost the back and forth flow and were replaced with spamming these abilities until everything was dead, kinda like I was playing an ARPG. Sure, punches remained part of my arsenal, but normal difficulty was reduced to easy mode as a result of these tools and skills. So long as I made sure to save my instant finishers for bigger enemies, everything went a bit too smoothly. I think increasing how long it takes for abilities to cool down, as well as limiting the number of uses gadgets had, would have helped restore a healthy point of balance. And yes, I know, I could have chose not to use them, but if the option is there, players are going to abuse it. These overpowered weapons can also be used against the game's many boss fights, which I love by the way. I hate when games remove your normal capabilities for boss fights, but that isn't the case here. And it doesn't make these fights a cakewalk because luckily, the big bads are more resilient than your common petty criminal. Outside of the opening spectacle fight with Sandman, many of the bosses feel like properly designed bouts that emphasize the enemy's particular powers. Venom can use his symbiote stretchiness to send a pulse of goo throughout the battlefield. Kraven can disappear and launch surprise attacks on you, and Martin Lee can use his negative energy to repel your attacks. And there's many other excellent encounters too, including one surprise one that I won't spoil, but it's all on brand. At the same time, many of these boss fights contain multiple stages, and while each sequence isn't supremely unique from the other, each offers a few new moves to contend with. These fights were just a ton of fun, while importantly being more challenging than the normal waves of foes. Spider-Man 2 continues its trend of borrowing from Arkham by introducing levels reminiscent of the Predator section in those Batman games. You're often let loose to prowl and lurk about, picking off goons one at a time. One of the best new mechanics comes into play here, and that would be the web lines. At the press of a button, you can create a traversable web line that allows you to get a drop on enemies from whatever angle you need. It's an extremely flexible tool, and pairing it up with distractions will give you the opportunity to clear out a whole room without anyone even knowing you were there. It's pretty great, and I love these sections. So overall, combat in Spider-Man 2 remains a lot of fun, but it certainly is a bit more turn your brain off than we've seen in the previous games. A litany of overpowered abilities, finishers, and gadgets makes combat feel like a breeze. You know it's bad when you feel comfortable entering a base with 50 plus enemies and starting combat immediately without taking any time to pick off guards and stealth. That's the case here. You almost feel invulnerable. If you want any challenge from this game on a consistent basis, start the game on hard mode. When you aren't fighting or moving about the city, you'll most likely be solving a handful of puzzles or engaging in a stealth section. One of the main puzzle types this time around revolves around destroying harmful parts of chemical compounds, and I found this one to be super satisfying. I'm not sure why, as they weren't that hard, but they were fun to complete. It was probably due to the sound work and the animations. I thought it looked cool. There's a couple other good ones, like where you match up shapes to gene splice plant DNA together. Oh, and there's spider bot sections too, which are fun enough. Most of the puzzles aren't brainbusters, but they do serve their role of breaking up the gameplay. Of course, the real question on many players' minds was whether the Mary Jane stealth sections would return, and while they have, they are dramatically better this time around. There's only 3, and while stealth is still emphasized, you aren't locked into it completely. At first, MJ has her trusty taser, but eventually it gets upgraded with web shooters that allow you to incapacitate Kraven's hunters. Getting caught usually means instant death, but it's not all set in stone. You can run away or maybe web up an enemy right before they are able to kill you. The ability to fight back a bit makes these sections more tolerable, and honestly, they get shorter as you continue to play, which is appreciated. It's clear they didn't want to abandon these sections completely, and I think they found a happy medium here. They still are complete pace breakers compared to the fast sections that Spidey has, but they are tolerable if not a little immersion breaking. Interestingly enough, there's also a section where you play as fully powered Venom, but it mostly feels like a tech demo to show off the destruction physics on the PS5. It really seemed out of place to me, and it came off as an excuse to kill off Kraven without making Peter or Miles do it. It felt a little forced, and since he controls like a less fluid and nerfed version of Spider-Man, it just seemed like an odd inclusion. There's a few things throughout the game that gives you the impression that Sony was in Insomniac's ear, telling them some must-haves in the game to flex the power of the PlayStation 5, and that was certainly one of them. Alright, outside the main story, what else is there to do in Spider-Man 2? Well, quite a bit, but I'd argue it's actually less impressive and interesting than our first adventure with the Webhead. I'd go so far as to say that I found much of the side content to be disappointing, not just because of their repetitiveness, but also because the finales and rewards didn't offer much joy. Unlike the original game, random crimes do not count towards 100% completion, and honestly, without requiring me to do so, I found myself stopping at random crimes less and less the further I got into the experience. I talked about how these play into the fantasy of living Spider-Man's imbalanced life, but that certainly wore off as I got into the second half of the experience. So much other side content was there, and that stole away most of my focus. I think stopping random crimes should have been a part of the completion percentage to enhance the danger associated with being an everyday Spider-Man. So what does count towards full completion? Well, first up you have your random little collectibles. These include photo ops where you capture the spirit of New York City, as well as collecting spider bots, which is used to set up a reference to the larger Spider-Verse. Spider-Bots, Spider-Man, Spider-Verse, it's just all spiders all the time, isn't it? Oh, and there's also recovering Sandman's broken memories after your fight with him. Anyway, these are largely forgettable, meant to act as quick dopamine hits as you temporarily diverge from your path to snag one before continuing on, forgetting about them seconds later. Returning from Miles Morales is the friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man app, and it's used to set up little side stories this time around. They do a good enough job of portraying how Miles and Peter give back to the community, by helping in ways that doesn't necessarily involve punching in the faces of bad dudes. However, I just didn't find many of them to be clever, memorable, or interesting. There's one where you grant a blind lady a different sort of seeing eye dog. There's helping out a pair of brothers with their fireworks gone wrong experiment, and even a sequence where you play as Haley and spray some graffiti. This last one, while a fine inclusion, really doesn't contribute much to the story or the fantasy being portrayed here, and while it does deliver a perfectly wholesome and inoffensive message, it just didn't really fit in. It felt forced, kind of like the Venom section. Even the mission involving Howard, that's supposed to provide a little bit of emotion, came off as flat to me. Basically, this returning character asks you to release his pigeons into a safe place, and once you do so, you return to find that Howard has died. It's like the dude knew he had minutes left to live, got Spider-Man's help, and then just perished immediately. It's super quick, jarring, and not set up well. Having a character die only carries weight if you've properly built to it. This is doubly true when, once the mission ends, Peter never mentions it again and immediately starts talking about helping someone else. There's no emotional resonance in the moment or afterwards, leaving this supposedly heavy moment feeling like just another checkmark for your list. I don't really get all the praise I see for this quest online. This is also true of the Brooklyn Visions quests, in which Miles helps out his classmates in a series of school-related missions. You help with a prom proposal, you aid in creating a new recruitment video for the school, and you recover a stolen mascot. It's fine, again, harmless checklist content that pales in comparison to the quality of side content we've seen in other games recently, even within the PlayStation Studios family. There's two other quest lines, one about helping the local cultural museum after a break-in, and another focused on helping Yuri stop the flame. The cultural museum one is extremely predictable, and the twist can be seen coming from miles and miles away, resulting in the whole thing feeling boring. The flame questline is at least a little bit better, but will be confusing to anyone who hasn't played the DLC from the first game, and yup, I fall into that. I was baffled at how this character came to be here and in this state, but honestly, that's not really the game's fault. Building off old content is fine, but it will certainly leave some players a bit confused. Why I find it to be disappointing though is that this 4-part questline isn't resolved here, and is instead used to set up a Carnage plotline in the inevitable sequel. This game's content must suffer so that the next game can go all out, and I found that to be a huge letdown. Next up, we have the EMF missions, which are reminiscent of the Oscorp research missions in the first game. These provide momentary distractions and are relatively harmless. I found myself even enjoying these, even if they were a bit repetitive at times. That being said, 2 of the more notable glitches I experienced during my playthrough came while playing these modes. This included not letting me collect a plant, and glitching my malfunctioning bike into a ramp before it exploded. Regardless, I think they were a decent inclusion, and the final one provides the puzzle that stumped me the longest, while also giving an emotional punch after the main story had concluded. Everything else are mission concepts repeated multiple times. This includes following some drones around to uncover a hidden supervillain's base, although just like Carnage, you won't see him or fight him in this game, it's just a setup. There's also symbiote nests, which act like pseudo zone control mode. You gotta protect your sound device from symbiote aliens as they warm up to destroy the nest. Repetitive, but not bad. You have hunter blinds and bases to clear out, again very reminiscent of something similar from the first game, and from Miles Morales. Because I felt so overpowered, these were over in the blink of an eye. There's also Prowler stashes, which, much like the game's other puzzle sections, hardly qualify as puzzles, but are fine. You play as Miles and have to power up Uncle Aaron's old stashes to collect rewards while learning more about the family background. It's alright. And finally, there's Mysteriums, which are a lot of fun. These are combat sections with specific challenges incorporated into them, often testing your mastery of the controls by restricting you in ways like taking no damage or beating everyone in a certain time frame. They also end with an actual fight against Mysterio, instead of just setting up a fight for the next game. And that really is what bothers me most about the side content in Spider-Man 2. Much of it serves one of 2 roles: give the player quick but unmeaningful dopamine hits to keep them happy and playing, or to set something up for the next game. You're constantly completing these mini tasks, which provide you with experience and tokens that funnel into upgrades and new suits, so it feels good, but it's nothing that's going to stick with you after the game goes back on your shelf. There's no lasting heart, soul, or memories to take from it. And on the other hand, despite fighting quite a few iconic villains throughout the main story, it really feels like the side content was severely lacking in this. Tombstone, Screwball, and Taskmaster are some of Marvel's lesser-known villains, but they got time to shine in the first title, and outside of Mysterio, none do here. Carnage and Chameleon are teased, but nothing comes from it. The first game was not afraid to show off the Rogues Gallery, but Spider-Man 2 takes a distinct step back from that, at least in the side content. All in all, I felt the side stuff here was much weaker than the original game, and even Miles Morales to a degree. Luckily, the main story isn't afraid to throw some of Spider-Man's villains around, like Venom, Kraven, Lizard, and a few others. However, that's not really the point the main story is going for. Instead, this is a narrative that really focuses on Spider-Man's biggest struggle, finding the balance between living as an everyday New Yorker and as a superhero. The first third or so of the story shows both Peter and Miles struggling to maintain a healthy balance. Miles misses out on meeting his mom's new boyfriend because he has to go do Spider-Man stuff. Meanwhile, his friends seem almost absent from his life, as they often only converse through cell phone. And while all of them are busy applying for colleges, Miles is struggling to submit his application, not only because he doesn't have time to write it, but also because he's torn on how to write about himself. He doesn't know what his life is outside of being Spider-Man, and trying to incorporate that into a college acceptance submission without seeming crazy is impossible. Meanwhile, Peter struggles as well. May's house sits dirty, littered, and literally broken as Peter doesn't have the time to keep up with the bills or tidy things up. It leaves a lot of pressure on his girlfriend, Mary Jane, to cover for him, while she struggles in her own right to appease a boss that she doesn't agree with. This puts strain on their relationship, which really comes to a head in one of the best sequences in the title. Ultimately, it's clear that both Miles and Peter are struggling to balance the responsibility of being Spider-Man with the responsibility of being good to those that they care for. It's established really well, and while it isn't a theme new to this character, viewing it from two different perspectives and ages makes it feel fresh again. Simply by including Miles, a uniqueness enters the fray, giving this tired theme an energized feel. From here, this theme is explored by incorporating a common but effective storytelling device, an object or entity that brings the character the necessary power to face their challenges, but also one that has corruptive elements. In Star Wars, it's the dark side of the Force, and here, well, it's Venom, baby. As Miles grapples with his day-to-day life, as well as the unresolved uneasiness surrounding his father's death at the hands of Martin Li, Peter becomes more and more distant from him, leaving the young man to feel unsure of who he really is. Without Peter's mentorship, Miles really grapples with self-identity, but ends up finding the strength he needs by confronting those demons head-on. Literally. Meanwhile, Peter's distancing comes from the Venom symbiote. As Peter attempts to find balance, he accepts a job alongside his childhood friend, Harry Osborn. It's a relationship that's been explored ad nauseum, and once again, here we find a similar setup. Harry is dying, but is granted a second chance at life through a corruptive force. Goblin serum in the past, and probably in the future, honestly, but through the Venom symbiote here. It grants him strength and leads to some cool team-ups between Harry and Peter. However, the symbiote eventually chooses Pete in a time of dire need, leading this hero down a dark path. Peter feels the allure of Venom's additional power, feeling like he's a more efficient Spider-Man with it, possibly leading to more time saved to tend to his everyday life. He views it as a fast track to stop the recently arrived Kraven, who's causing mass panic all over the city in the name of his final hunt. Of course, Peter's new perspective is just the symbiote wreaking havoc on his mind and body. The game never dips too far into the darkness though, instead allowing Pete to hold on to his morality, but just making him a more neglectful, ruthless, and mean-spirited person. He neglects and scolds a dying Harry and can't understand his girlfriend's concerns. He never outright kills anyone, but is shown to be more vicious in combat, and as a player, you can feel the added strength of these special moves, helping to tie gameplay and storytelling together quite nicely. Miles is even kidnapped during this time, as Peter becomes more and more consumed by the symbiote, going so far as to attack Mary Jane, who just barely escapes. Meanwhile, Miles, whose capture results in him coming face to face with Martin Li, actually leads to a bit of clarity for the character. As Li uses his power to infiltrate Spider-Man's mind, Miles shows resilience by believing in the lessons instilled by his father, and when given the chance to kill Li and enact revenge, he chooses mercy, and actually saves Li instead of himself. And as a side note, it really impressed me once again how the villains are humanized in this series. Li, Sandman, and even Kraven to a degree are given moments of redemption, sympathy, or at the very least understanding. You can see why they are doing what they do and feeling how they feel, and I love that added character depth. Anyway, all of this comes to a boil when both Spider-Men come face to face against each other. Miles wants to save Pete from the suit, but Pete can't understand why everyone has turned against him. It results in an incredible boss fight that's really a lot of fun to experience, and is only further improved by the narrative weight it holds. Up to this point, Miles beat himself up a bit on allowing Li to live, when he had the chance to let him die, but through confronting Li directly, he remembers the value in saving lives, all lives, believing in second chances no matter the personal pain. It's a lesson Pete taught him as well, and now that same mentor is losing himself as he attempts to kill Kraven. Miles ends up reminding Pete of the lesson he and his father had originally taught him, and it's just awesome. It leads to Peter being freed from Venom's grip, but the fun doesn't end there. This moment really ends up being the emotional height the story reaches, as the final third of the game won't have as much weight to it. The tale shifts to being more plot focused instead of character driven, but I think that's alright. They want to give a final epic confrontation with a Spider-Man megavillain, and what we got here certainly delivers. As the symbiote is reunited with Harry, it transforms him, consuming him completely and giving way to the Venom we know and love. And from here, it's just about chasing what's cool and epic as Venom goes on a rampage across the city, transforming citizens into symbiotes, messing with Peter's relationships, and eventually gaining the power to turn the whole world into symbiote goo. It all culminates in a final showdown of Peter versus Harry, and ends predictably with saving the friend who scientists said were beyond saving. The symbiote is killed in the process, which instantly cures everyone affected while destroying all the goo that was taking over the city. We wrap up some loose threads, and then get teased on the upcoming stuff we will see in Spider-Man 3, including Green Goblin, a return from Doc Ock, and a hint at a new member into the Spider family. So all in all, we have a pretty good Spider-Man story on offer here, although I don't think it's as tightly written as it could have been. There's a lot of characters to juggle, and when Miles and Peter's stories already feel a bit familiar and lackluster, nothing of true greatness can be achieved. I appreciate them taking the time to flesh out characters, especially the villains, but I don't feel the game will leave me with many lasting memories. It also just makes the story messier and less cohesive while continuing to sell us on the next game. There's a lot going on here, and while I think it gels for the most part, it's certainly not the tightest script. It has a bit of that Spider-Man 3 syndrome in this regard, if you know what I mean. It's just another good Spider-Man story to pile on top of the other good Spider-Man stories already residing in my brain after 20 plus years of fandom. The main story and side content weren't the only things that left a little bit to be desired, because while mostly strong, the presentation does have more hiccups than you'd expect from a first-party Sony game. Starting with the good, and obviously this game looks incredible most of the time, especially during the evening and at night. The lighting just looks incredible, whether it's the way sunlight dances and reflects on the murky waters, or how light pours out of windows on darkened skyscrapers. While certainly not the best looking game we've seen yet, there's still a lot to appreciate. You won't find the most detailed textures and models, but when you're zipping past everything so quickly, it can easily be overlooked, forgiven, and downright accepted. The set pieces in this game are plentiful and always excellent. It's clear Insomniac wanted to deliver a sense of awe and spectacle, even more so than in the first game, and they delivered that wholeheartedly. Even a mundane mission like saving Tombstone from a bunch of hunters is granted a sense of style and flair by continuing to push the scale closer to epic and cool. I also love how the set pieces affect the lay of the land after they conclude. J. Jonah Jameson's vindictive attitudes towards Spider-Man is further justified when you can see things like how massive a mess is left to clean up following Sandman's rampage. The soundtrack itself was really good, lots of memorable and hyped music to accompany fights, my favorite of which was Kraven's theme. That heavy horn sound effect always instilled a sense of dread, as the character himself nearly reaches a Bane-esque feel. It's been a great year for video game music, and I'm not even someone who pays attention to that all that much. Sound work also really amazing, especially in combat, providing a lot of punch to the animations. With all that being said, there were some negatives that need to be brought up. I'm surprised that this game ended up being a bit buggier than I expected. While it was by no means a Bethesda launch day experience, I did have a couple of bugs like the previously mentioned glitchy bike and plant. I've also seen reports of other mishaps, the funniest of which is when Spider-Man gets turned into a cube. I didn't run into anything game-breaking, but I was a bit surprised to run into the problems that I found. I also feel that the character models and facial animations need more work. Many characters, especially Peter and Mary Jane, lack a little bit of extra facial work, those extra textures to make it look real, and as a result, they kind of look like they're made of clay. The lips also don't look like they're moving appropriately at times, giving off this uncanny valley vibe. This is one component that Insomniac really stands to improve in. And speaking of Insomniac, they seem to be the default studio selected by Sony to show off the power of the PS5. This was a big talking point when Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart came out, and it remains true here. Between putting the fast in fast travel, loading interior areas quickly, showing off the resistance in the trigger buttons, and demonstrating a lot of destruction amongst other things. I think these are fine inclusions, but they were super noticeable, and it did take me out of the experience a little bit. You could almost feel the developer saying, hey, look what we can do with the PlayStation 5, isn't that cool? Ooh, you like that? It's like, it's fine, but it kind of takes me out of the game. And finally, on a personal note, I was a bit disappointed in the suits. I thought a lot of them were ugly, despite having many color palettes to swap between. I really missed the comic suit from the first game. But it's whatever, that's pretty much all subjective anyway. All in all, Insomniac has delivered us another great Spider-Man game. Despite having a lot in common with the previous two, it introduces just enough new ideas to keep the game feeling like a proper sequel. Between Predator-esque missions, web wings, and new gadgets and skills, it's just barely enough. However, that sense of fatigue continues to creep up. There's not a ton of great ways to mitigate this, but a change in scenery might be a good place to start. As it is now, some elements of the Spider-Man's checklist side content disappoint this time around, and feel like a step backwards from the 2018 game. Along with that, we have a good, but somewhat muddied Spider-Man story, and a few hiccups in the presentation. Despite improving their craft in some ways, Insomniac has not offered quite enough to truly deflect any notion that this is a 1.5 version or a really big DLC. While I don't personally feel this way, I can see how some people might feel that this is another 1.5 version of the original game, kinda like they said about Miles Morales. I can see how some could make that argument even if I don't agree with it, and the reason I don't believe it is because this game's a lot bigger than Miles Morales. So the value proposition isn't really off, I think it's worth the $70, but the team needs to take bigger strides in a third game to really deliver something special. They partially sacrificed on the feel of this game to cram in as much as possible into the next one, so here's hoping it delivers. As it stands now, I still heavily recommend Spider-Man 2 to every PlayStation 5 owner. It's one of those games that's fast, fluid, fun, and will remain a very good game in a year packed with very good games. It won't reach for the Game of the Year status in my eyes, but it's very much that fun to play, easy to platinum experience that we get a few times a year. In this case, more of a good thing was just a good thing. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, hope you enjoyed this look at Insomniac's Spider-Man 2. I certainly enjoyed playing it. It was like eating one of my favorite meals. I know what to expect, but that doesn't stop it from being great. As 2023 winds down, I want to make videos on Starfield and Persona 5 Tactica before we reach January. I'd love to play some Baldur's Gate 3, but I'm not sure if I'll have time for a video or not. Regardless though, thank you as always for continuing to take the time to listen to my thoughts on these games. You know I love engaging with you guys in the comments, whether you have good or critical things to say, so let me know what you thought of this video and of Spider-Man 2. As always guys, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp, join our Discord, the link is below, and as always guys, have a nice day and take care.